Where was Jonbenet's brother when she was killed, and what was he doing? And was he ever cleared?
And how hopeful are you that someday we will find who truly killed Jonbenet?
Certainly the advances in genealogy search are incredibly promising.
My name is John Andrew Ramsey, Jonbenet's half-brother. Jonbenet would go around and ask everybody how their day was and what they did, and he was just an energetic and fun kid.
What made this question, where was John Andrew when Jonbenet was killed? What made this such a fraught question from the get-go was that there was an eyewitness account from an unknown neighbor who had reported seeing John Andrew in Boulder on Christmas Day.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The day before Jonbenet's funeral, speculation reached fever pitch that Jonbenet's older brother, John Andrew, who at the time was a student at Colorado University, had played a role in her death.
John Andrew, you're Jonbenet's half-brother. You were 20 years old, away at college when she was murdered.
The shitstorm of rumors swirling around this question eventually led to the Boulder police to release an unprecedented statement. This was on the 30th of December 1996, the day before the funeral. For immediate release, contact Leslie Ahome, Media Relations. Monday, December 30th, update on Ramsey case. The adult children were out of state at the time of the incident. Although John Andrew wasn't mentioned by name here, the intention was to suggest that he had an alibi. Well, did he? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, I've mentioned in the past that I want to deal with the photographic narrative, and we will be dealing with that in the next episode. Look out for that. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So what was also driving speculation was the combined situation that the extremely high-profile nature of the crime, it was like snowballing in the media, then the fact that no one had been arrested, and then combined with that, the apparent complacency from the cops who wanted to let the Ramsey neighbors know that there wasn't any cause for concern. They didn't seem to be looking for a killer on the loose. And Boulder PD, as well as the mayor of Boulder, were explicit about this as well. As far as they were concerned, Boulder was safe. Was that because the suspect had left Boulder and the cops knew that he was in Atlanta? So have a look at this excerpt from the same press release. Boulder police have not detained anyone, nor have they identified any suspects at this time. Police want to let neighbors know there is no cause for concern. Now, what few people realize is that despite indirectly exonerating John Andrew early on, he was nevertheless investigated as a legitimate suspect, and this went on for days, weeks, and eventually months. During this time, the cops also struggled to get proper handwriting samples from Patsy Ramsey. As late as March 1997, the cops felt they couldn't get proper handwriting samples from Patsy. Why? Because she was apparently too medicated. Look at this press release from March 6, 1997. Various items in the case have been sent to Cellmark Diagnostics in Maryland for DNA testing. The items were delivered on Tuesday, February 28th. The testing by Cellmark could take up to 6 weeks for results. Boulder police are in receipt of a third set of handwriting samples from Ms. Patricia Ramsey. These items were collected by Boulder police on Friday, February 28th. This is the important part. Police had difficulty obtaining satisfactory samples because Ms. Ramsey is reported to have been taking medication since December 26th. Now, this definitely puts into perspective John Ramsey's comment on January 1st saying, "We are healing." The too medicated Patsy was also the excuse given initially for why Patsy couldn't give a formal interview to the cops from the get-go. By the time the cops caught up to John Andrew in Atlanta, they were surprised to find that he'd lawyered up as well, along with his mother and sister. Boulder detectives traveled to Roswell, Georgia for the express purpose of collecting conclusive evidence that would allow us to eliminate John Andrew and Melinda from suspicion in this case. Upon arrival, we were informed that John Ramsey had retained attorney James Jenkins in Atlanta to represent Lucinda Johnson, that's his first wife, Melinda, and John Andrew. Mr. Jenkins declined to allow his clients to speak with us. As a result, alternative sources of information had to be developed, which delayed our ability to publicly issue this information. Meanwhile, early in the same month that the formal interview with Jonbenet's half-brother was meant to take place, John Andrew was embroiled in a strange incident. He'd lashed out at a photographer, and the photographer made a big stink about it. Have a look at this article in the Rocky Mountain News, dated the 4th of April, 1997, Ramsey's son accused in assault. A photographer working for the National Enquirer told police that he was assaulted by John Ramsey's eldest son at Denver International Airport this week. Ramsey, 20, swung his hands at Butterfield and knocked Butterfield's camera from his hands, according to the photographer. Now, what I think is contextually quite sneaky about the Netflix series is it turns Steve Thomas into the bad guy. He's had this single-minded view that Patsy did it all along. Actually, no. He went to the trouble to investigate and exclude other potential suspects, including going to the trouble to track down John Andrew and sit down with him for 2 hours. What stands out in Thomas's direct interaction with John Ramsey's son is that he felt John Andrew had a chip on his shoulder, or in Thomas's words, an attitude. Gossage and I interviewed 20-year-old John Andrew Ramsey. He was a lanky young man with dark eyes and short dark hair, who wore a checkered shirt, a winter jacket, and an attitude. When the blood tech moved close with her needle, the former Eagle Scout, who is now a third-semester sophomore at the University of Colorado, whispered, "I may pass out." This is an interesting observation from Thomas. It might be subjective, but it wasn't the first time Thomas felt something weird. In his book, he relates an incident outside a church in Boulder where Jonbenet's half-brother had apparently demanded that the officer control the paparazzi. Thomas writes in his book that he didn't appreciate being treated like the hired help. But there was also another important reason for the cops to clear John Andrew. A police source had supposedly suggested a bizarre scenario where John Andrew had apparently wanted to kill his half-sister by staging an accidental death, and I think it involved boats. This led to an investigation inside the investigation. Who leaked this information about John Andrew? Let's go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. The accusation of a one-time police informant that John Andrew had tried to stage an accidental death in order to kill Jonbenet was clearly preposterous. Morgan, that's the lawyer, Brian Morgan, again requested an official announcement that John Andrew was no longer a possible suspect. By now, the police had received the test results from John Andrew and Melinda's hair, blood, and handwriting. At the time, the only possible match to evidence found at the crime scene was the pubic hair found on the white blanket in the basement, which held some slight similarities to Melinda's. So they find a pubic hair on the white blanket, and they're thinking, could this have belonged to John Andrew? And then they found, well, it actually has more similarities to Melinda's. But then Melinda's alibi was even tighter than her brother's, and it was not likely that she had used the same blanket when she stayed with the family. So is the plot thickening, or is the plot sort of unraveling? The police seem to be getting no closer to making any progress. But do you see that even John Andrew's sister, Melinda, seemed to become a viable suspect at one point based on a single black hair found on Jonbenet's white blanket? A hair that was felt to belong to a female. It was also thought that it was a pubic hair. Well, I can tell you now it actually wasn't. And that is another narrative we can go and deal with. This hair and where it was eventually, and to whom it was eventually traced to. That is an item of evidence we still need to talk about. So now we get to it. Where exactly was John Andrew, and what was he doing on the night Jonbenet was killed? Do you know the answer to this question? Well, perhaps 28 years later, it's time that we settle this matter. And we can do so via Detective Steve Thomas's book, Jonbenet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation. He writes, Detective Kim Stewart interviewed Melinda for almost 2.5 hours. Detectives Ron Gossage and Steve Thomas questioned her brother from 6 to 8 p.m. 20-year-old John Andrew was obviously upset, but he was composed enough to explain that he was a student at CU and had been in Boulder until December 19. Then he had gone to Atlanta to spend the first half of his vacation with his mother Lucinda Johnson and his sister and friends. Then the plan was to continue his vacation with his sister, father, stepmother, and their children. So do you see what is taking place here? There's a second Christmas taking place with the sort of consolidated family. John Andrew said that his father had arranged to meet him and his sister in Minneapolis at about 10:30 a.m. on December 26th. And from there, they would all continue on to the house in Charlevoix, Michigan. In the months that followed, the police would confirm that John Andrew, his mother, and her friend Harry Smiles had attended the Peachtree Presbyterian Church in Atlanta on Christmas Eve, and that John Andrew had returned to his mother's home at 1 a.m. So I guess, meanwhile, Melinda, who worked at a hospital in Marietta, Georgia, finished her shift at about 7 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day. That afternoon, John Andrew, Harry Smiles, Melinda, and her boyfriend Stuart Long exchanged gifts at Lucinda's home in Marietta. In the afternoon, they all went across the street to a neighbor's for dinner. So all of these would be witnesses, alibi witnesses in terms of John Andrew's version of events. So in short, where was John Andrew? Well, he was in Marietta, Georgia with a friend, right, on Christmas night playing computer games. Have a look at this. At about 8:30 p.m., that's Christmas night, John Andrew went to his friend Brad Millard's home in Marietta to play video games. After an hour, they left to catch a 10:30 show, in other words, a movie, at the Town and Country movie theaters in Marietta with another friend, Chris Stanley. John Andrews said that after the movie, he went back to Brad Millard's house to get his car and arrived back at his mother's house at 1 a.m. The next morning, he left his mother's house with Melinda, who had come there to pick him up. Together, they boarded a flight to Minneapolis at 8:36 a.m. local time. That was 44 minutes after Patsy called 911 to report that Jonbenet was missing. Now, you might say, well, that's easy for anyone to say, but can he prove where he was? This is just lots of different people that are vouching for him. But could he prove where he was? Well, how could he do that? Now, going back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, 2.5 months after the Boulder police began investigating John Andrew and Melinda, they received the final pieces of evidence that cleared Ramsey's older children of any involvement in Jonbenet's murder. And this really settled the matter. Brian Morgan, that's the Ramsey lawyer, Brian Morgan wrote to Detective Thomas on March 4th stating that John Andrew had made an ATM transaction at the QT store on Roswell Road in Marietta, Georgia. That was at 9 p.m. on December the 25th. His friend Brad Millard had been present. To support his claim, Morgan enclosed the ATM transaction slip. He also repeated that Melinda had awakened her brother in the early morning hours of December 26th, in time for him to stop at a store and still make an 8:30 a.m. flight to Minneapolis. It was impossible for John Andrew to have flown from Atlanta to Boulder, whether by commercial or private aircraft, commit the murder and return in time to be awakened by his sister in the presence of Brad Millard, who had stayed overnight in John Andrews' room. Now, isn't that an interesting postscript to the whole thing? Is that just before this flight, John Andrew is staying in a room, playing computer games late at night, and Brad Millard, his friend, is with him in the room. And so you might say as well, why on earth would someone be with someone else? Why would two friends be with each other if you were leaving first thing the next morning? Well, maybe you're very good friends. Maybe that's the reason. Now, besides having multiple alibi witnesses, essentially in terms of his pals, that's Brad Millard and Chris Stanley, as well as his mother and sister, and presumably even the patrons of the cinema he went to, he had a time-stamped ATM slip that could geolocate him along with the movie stubs, assuming that he kept them. Steve Thomas, to his credit, then cross-referenced this evidence with flight schedules and determined, as Lawrence Schiller writes, that it was impossible for John Andrew to be in two places at once. It's actually incredible that it took 2.5 months to clear John Andrew. One would imagine it could or should easily have taken 1 or 2 days. But even more incredible is that to this day, people throw John Andrew's name out as a potential suspect.
Stop it!
Are you one of them? If you are, please.
Stop it!
So do you see the takeout from this whole narrative is that it was ultimately Detective Steve Thomas who followed up on leads, including flight schedules, and definitively ruled out A. Ramsey, in this case, John Andrew, that he did indeed have an alibi. And this is something that Steve Thomas actually said directly to John Ramsey. He said, I exhausted John Andrew and made sure that there was no way that he could have got a flight between Atlanta in the middle of the night, and to the point I checked flight schedules and the passenger list. And he said, I'll do the same for you. I'm going to verify everything you tell me. And so what you see is a detective diligently and conscientiously doing his job and allowing the evidence to guide him. And despite his fixation on Patsy, he did the Ramseys a favor by definitively excluding John Andrew. John Andrew, did you know this? John Andrew was actually the first person in the Ramsey investigation to be removed from the suspect list, which is why bringing up his name today shows a particularly high level of ignorance regarding this case.
John Andrew, you're Jonbenet's half-brother. You were 20 years old, away at college when she was murdered, and you were one of the first family members to be cleared by investigators. But even then, this suspicion, as your father pointed out, hovered over the heads of your family to the point where here you are all these years later, you're still taking on, the police, the media.
Now, personally, what I think is absurd about the whole John Andrew suspect thing is John Andrew was 20 years old and he was a student at Colorado University. Wouldn't he be hanging out with college girls and doing the things that college students do? Why would he have that kind of interest in a 6-year-old? In any event, from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, the announcement about the Ramsey children marked the first time in the 10-week investigation that police have removed any name from the list of suspects. Pat Corton, the Ramsey media consultant, posted on his website, the Ramsey family is grateful that the police have announced that John Andrew and Melinda are not suspects in this case. But you won't see Netflix giving their poster boy bad cop any credit for clearing John Andrew, and I'm not sure I've seen John Andrew doing the same either. There's another aspect we haven't dealt with here, which is John Andrew's opinion of the ransom note and the ransom note writer, which came about when Steve Thomas was questioning him. I found it quite curious. Let me know if you'd like me to go into it. Because during that discussion, John Andrew also provides his opinion on who he thinks is a likely suspect for the killer of his half-sister. The investigation into John Andrew brings about an interesting caveat, potentially. If one of Jonbenet's brothers had an attitude and was playing computer games and watching a movie until late at night with a friend, that's on Christmas night, with a trip about to take place early the next morning. I mean, John Andrew even had a friend stay over in his room prior to his planned trip in Michigan. And did you notice the reference to him being an Eagle Scout? Is it so hard to imagine that things weren't so very different for Burke? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.